Hello, can you hear me, see me? Great. Now let's see if my PowerPoint behaves. I shall turn off camera because it's slowing down the whole process and I'll share slides. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay. Um, can you see the slide? I haven't. Just a minute. 1 minute. Share. It's okay. Is share screen? Come on. Window. Right. Finally. Okay. So we were discussing Edward. Today we'll have to finish off Said and Edward Said and Franz Fanon, the fiery revolutionary thinker, psychiatrist and revolutionary thinker, and also touch upon Homi K. Bhabha's ideas of mimicry. So now we, I think I kind of mentioned a little bit Edward Said's publication of Orientalism made such an impact on thinking about colonial discourse or colonial thoughts that for 2 decades it has continued to be the site of controversy, adulation, as well as criticism. Said's intervention is designed to illustrate the manner in which the representation of Europe's others, which means I am the ruler, and the others, that is, the colonized, the ruled, have been institutionalized, so to speak, since at least the 18th century as a feature of its cultural dominance. Now, when we say cultural dominance, it was sort of a grooming, a complete molding, which we will see in the works of all three of these writers they mention. This kind of cultural dominance, psychological dominance, to the extent of intimidating through violent means that the colonizers the practices of the colonizers. Orientalism describes what Said does is that conceptually, some he feels this is Said's point of view. There have been many writers who have refuted or contradicted his views, saying that it was blinkered, it was very narrow, it was unnecessarily provocative. But Orientalism describes the various disciplines, institutions, processes of investigation, and styles of thought by which Europeans came to know the Orient over several centuries, and which reached their height during the rise and consolidation of the 19th century imperialism. Now, the basic thinking process was fairly simple, that I, as the West, is I am superior in my thinking power, in the culture that I practice, my system, the way, my way of functioning. This is superior and civilized as compared to the East, which is the other, which means it is not us. It is us and them, very binary. This term binary comes up in the criticism of all three writers. Binary. It's a very zero and one. We are one, they are zero. So it's a very black and white, very absolute. That they are nothing, we are everything. Hence, we need to take over to civilize these people because they are the lesser mortals. Because their culture is not our culture, or because their culture is completely alien to us, it is not up to the mark. Now, we have to consider the backgrounds of Edward Said, particularly Edward Said, and more so of Franz Fanon. Because Edward Said is a Palestinian, originally he's a Palestinian gentleman, and he was exiled with his family from Palestine. Like many Palestinians who left Palestine to go to other countries to seek refuge, and they grew up there and they flourished there. But if you see, I'll during the doubt clearing classes, if I don't have time today, during the doubt clearing classes, I shall share a few videos of Edward Said where he discusses. He says that the West. He talks particularly in terms of America and Israel as vis-a-vis Palestine, and he says this when he talks about culture, he says that in every channel of culture, whether it's literature, whether it's movies, whether it's paintings, the Orient is seen, and it's a very fixed image of it's stuck in a time warp. It's like it has not advanced. It is not civilized in the sense that the West feels that the East has been stuck for almost centuries in the same frame, and they have not progressed, they have not evolved. Hence, the participation, that stepping in of the West in order to make them aware of and familiarize them with what is progress, what is modern, how to move forward. That is what the mentality of the and hence we need to colonize them, hence we need to take over, hence we need to politically, culturally, psychologically dominate them in order to bring them up to the mark. Now, out of this basic concept has come all the others, have followed all the others, the hybridity and mimicry of Homi Bhabha, the concept of violent uprising of Franz Fanon, the concept of dehumanization of the colonized of Franz Fanon, and of course, the discourse of Edward Said on Orientalism. Sometimes he has even marveled at the gall of the West, so to speak, at the gall that the West thinks that what makes you think that you are superior? We could be different, but what makes you think that yours is the correct thing and ours is not, or the other one's is not? So, an American literary critic, post colonial theorist, let's just give a little bit of background on it. Unfortunately, he was an incredibly brilliant academician. He was at Columbia University. He died fairly early. He died of leukemia. Both him and Franz Fanon, they both died of leukemia. But he was a brilliant professor of post-colonial literature or post-colonial writings or post-colonial thinking theories. And mind you, he was an extremely debonair, very proper gentleman. Although he always said that the West is kind of trying to remodel, remold the non-Western countries, the East, the Orient. By the Orient, he meant particularly the Middle East, and also sometimes he referred to India and the Far East, China. But his concern, his issue was particularly with the Middle East, the Arab world, where he always felt very strongly that there was a very deplorable kind of misrepresentation of the Orient. The Orientalists, people who claim themselves to be Orientalists or authorities on the Oriental countries, their culture, their practice, their knowledge level, even their intelligence, perhaps, they actually were incredibly blinkered, and their own knowledge was completely insufficient to be even thinking, to sit in judgment of what the Orient is all about. So he said the Orient was, I mean, I'm not reading exactly line by line, but his concept was, like he said, that Orientalism ostensibly involves the description and definition of an alien culture. Now, if this is alien, well, it is alien. You don't know it. So before you know it, do not say, do not utter, do not say anything disparaging about that culture or that nation. So your main objective is to exercise control, and that's why you're saying that, oh, they're not good enough, we need to make them good, simply because of your own feeling of superiority, your own concept of superiority, your own, so to speak, narcissistic concept that I need to remodel this entire thing. Unless I go in, unless I step in, whether I'm British, whether I'm American, whether I'm Dutch, French, we'll particularly deal with the French and the British colonialism here, because these two were the most prominent ones during colonization. Of course, the Dutch were there, and the Portuguese were there, and everybody else was there. But in the context of India, we know that there were the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese. They were all there, but the main, the most prominent colonizers were the British from the West. So his contention is that what makes you feel, if you know that that is an alien culture without knowing it, what makes you think that you need to remold or remodel it? It's almost a how dare you attitude. How dare you say that my culture is inferior and that I need to remodel it or kind of completely annihilate, obliterate that and become you? So he says that Orientalism ostensibly involves the description and definition of an alien culture. It, in fact, embodies a discourse that is a kind of a communication or a discussion that through which European culture defined itself through providing a definition of the Oriental as exhibiting radically opposite tendencies. For example, the Oriental culture is irrational, instinctive, probably barbaric, probably it had no finesse. So, unless you're European, you're not really, so to speak, human. So, his central concern in Orientalism is the multiple relationships between the act of writing and cultural politics, language and power. And in one of the interviews, he says that look at the way the films show the Orient. And it is so typified, it is so essentialized, it's so stereotyped. It's like when you think of India, the man is always very dark skinned with probably a turban on his head, wearing long kurtas, and the woman is probably wearing a nut, head covered, probably bare feet, loads of jewelry in her on her, the loads of bangles on her two arms. You don't even want to know, don't know, and what is worse is you don't even want to know that they could be different. They could be different, or they could be just as advanced, if not more advanced, than you all are. So he attempts to show how Western journalists, and he says that time and time again, the Western media, whether it's journalists, whether it's fiction writers, whether it's scholars, help to build up a prevalent and hostile image of the Eastern cultures as inferior, stagnant, and degenerate. Think of the Western movies, where they always show, and this is a very typical mentality of the colonizer. Think of America; they always showed the the Indians, the Red Indians, as the villains, and they refused to. They said that we go to make the place better, otherwise the Indians will. They are really a savage lot. So they are here he's talking about the Orient. Eastern cultures are inferior, stagnant, and degenerate. He also attempts to show the extent to which these representations permeate the Western culture. The West exploited these representations to justify their imperialist policies that we must occupy, we must expand our empire there. Well, as I told you, he concentrates on the Middle East because he was from there and he personally experienced. And of course, he was not particularly happy about being displaced from his own place. Exploited these representations to justify their imperialist policies in the Middle East. And that there is a fixed idea in the mind in general. He felt in general in the West that if they are not like us, they must be villains. They are against us. What the Western media or the Western mindset did not have was that both kinds can coexist. You can be very British or very French or very Dutch or very German, and the other side could be very Indian or very Sri Lankan or very Burmese, but still be in their culture, they are very good, just as they are. They don't want to occupy your territory and convert you into them. That is his opinion, but there are loads of people opposing these views. In Orientalism, Edward Said has used various. Let me see if there's any. Now, Hello. Can you see me now? Okay. Okay, in Orientalism, Edward has used various derivatives of the word Orient, which literally means the east, of course, the direction from which the sun rises. Geopolitically, Orient signifies the Middle East, Asia, and the Far East, and territories that were once a part of one or another European empire. European, he's particularly saying most of the colonizers. Said uses the word Orient to signify a system of representation framed by political forces that brought the Orient or the East into the Western Empire. So he's talking about a system of representations. How is the East represented? It is represented in a way framed by political forces that suited the Western world, that suited the Western Empire, the Western learning, the Western consciousness. So we create this image just so that we justify to everybody that our presence was needed. You see, everything was wrong there till we went. The West uses the word in its relation to the East. It's a mirror image of the inferior, the alien, the other to the Occident, that is the West. And of course, as far as he's concerned, he says the color of the skin comes in very prominently. That we are light, they are darkness. They are dark, we are light. So we'll go into more analysis of that when we talk of Homi Bhabha's hybridity and mimicry, and the degree to which they would accept the mimicry and the hybridity as observed by them. Oriental is a noun form. What does it mean? Which means an individual or people of the Orient. As an adjective, the word qualifies anything belonging to the East, that is, Oriental landscape, Oriental literature, Oriental art, Oriental attitude. So, Orientalist is a person who studies or writes about the Orient. And Orientalism is used academically to signify, actually, the word Orientalism, although the term Orientalist means that a person who is studying the Orient, Orientalism academically is used to signify Western doctrines and theses about the Orient, what the West has written about the Orient. So, Said's idea is that, theory is that it's quite obvious that it'll be quite a bigoted, impartial account of the Orient. It'll not be an impartial, clear, true account of the Orient. That's what he felt, and the account that the Western person puts forward is obviously not is what suits him. He's trying to be politically correct towards his people and not being impartial and unbiased totally. Said also makes it clear that he's not attempting to cover the whole area. He focuses on mainly, like I said, on how American English and French scholars have approached the Arab societies of the Middle East and North Africa. Obviously, his concern was, and his area of concentration was that, having experienced the exile. The he had to move from his homeland to make a foreign country his home, and North Africa. The period he covers in his book extends from the late 18th century to the present, when the Middle East, uh, late 18th century up until to the present, when when the Middle Eastern crisis started, and then of course the 9/11 happened, and attitudes changed, what became worse, and how this kind of stereotypical attitude towards the East was it tainted, or it was like the whole thing was painted in a different tint. So his starting point in Orientalism is that the existence and development of every culture impels the existence of a different and inevitably competitive other or alter ego. I think I mentioned it in the last class. Therefore, Europe, in attempting to construct its self image, created the Middle East, the Orient, as the ultimate other. How? What is the ultimate other? The Middle East and the West do not correspond to any stable reality that exists as a natural fact, but are merely products of an artificial construction. That's what he feels. That is his idea. So he put forward several definitions of Orientalism into the introduction of his book, Orientalism. Some of these are: firstly, it's a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and, most of the time, the Occident. One second. So, based upon the existence and knowledge, like knowledge based and existence based distinction made between the Orient and the Occident, Said argued that his distinction emphasized the supremacy of the Occident versus the inferiority, which we discussed, inferiority of the Orient. Second, it's a field of academic research that includes everyone who teaches, investigates, and writes about the Orient. So what does he, why is he talking about Orient, or what is Orientalism in his mind, in his theory? It's about the distinction that exists between the East and the West, fundamentally in thoughts and in knowledge, in concept. Secondly, it's the supremacy, it's the emphasis laid on the supremacy of the Occident versus the Orient, the inferiority of the Orient. Secondly, it's a field of academic research that includes everyone who teaches, investigates, or writes, broadcasts about the Orient. Third, Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, beginning in the 18th century. It's almost an organized venture, an organized movement for dealing with the Orient. In short, it's the Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Moreover, it is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in the European Western culture and experience. That we have to grab this, take the bull by the horn, and deal with it. This is the image. This is what we see Orientalism or the Orient as, and we have to take it, we have to take him on or take it on the way it is and deal with it. In the light of this perception, the Middle East is static, unalterable, and can't define itself. I told you His idea was that the West thinks that the Orient has not really moved forward. It is stuck in its own groove. Therefore, through Orientalism, the West took it upon itself to represent the Orient, and by doing so, opened it to exploitation. What were they really doing? They were simply, in Said's opinion, they were in the name of improving or offering progress to the Orient, they were simply opening it up to exploitation. The very purpose of Orientalism is to take control of the Orient and take away from it any ability to speak for itself. Said maintained that it is the stereotypes and prejudices that determine the Western representation of the Orient. Obviously, if the purpose is exploitation, if the purpose is to take as much as I can out of a certain area of the world, then my opinion will have to be colored with prejudices. The way I represent the Orient. His definition of Orientalism as a discourse, as a theme of discussion, is he also described Orientalism as a discourse, a definition he takes from the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Foucault defined discourse as a system of thought that governs the knowledge obtained by a person. So the knowledge is a paraphrase of preconceived notions and ideas. So a discourse is really the product of interaction between power and knowledge interconnected in a never ending circle. And knowledge is power and also the way of gaining power. Because, simply because this is already based on preconceived notions and ideas. I have already decided that I'm going to gain control over, my objective is to gain control. Hence, I feel that, oh, they are inferior. Hence, there is a need for me to step in and make them better. And I'm offering them progress. In return, I'm simply taking out as much as I can for my own country or my own part of the world. It's a very simple equation. So, for following the ideas of Foucault, focused on the relationship between power and knowledge, he argued that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, first one has to take cognizance of Orientalism as a body of communication. One can't comprehend the hugely systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even construct the Orient politically, militarily, sociologically, scientifically, I would say psychologically also. It was a tremendous amount of psychological grooming. So much so that they tried to make the other person believe. This is in internet terms what we call grooming. You start to make the other person believe that, look, you are inferior and I'm here as your savior. So scientifically, imaginatively, ideologically during the post Enlightenment period. So the scope of Orientalism covers all the dimensions of the subject, both in terms of historical experiences and time period. Moreover, it covers the subject in terms of political as well as philosophical themes. He provides a review of the pre-18th century writing on the Muslim Near East and socio-political impact of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. According to him, the East was viewed as a textual universe for the West. The European Orientalists had keen interest in classical rather than contemporary periods of the Eastern culture. So, in the mind of the viewer, if you are already fixed with the idea that this is what the East looks like, that it's turbans and camels and tigers and snakes and elephants and snake charmers and dirt roads, and thatched houses. It, and that had your in your own mind, it has not, your own mind has not progressed. And that reflection, that is being reflected on the country that you are trying to study. So you already have this preconceived notion that that is old, that is barbaric, that is savage, that is uncivilized, without even wanting to know the culture already, the pre-existing culture that is there already, and how refined, how incredibly civilized, how, what kind of finesse that culture and the diversity that culture enjoyed. Without wanting to know, in your mind, you have already decided that that is an uncultured, uncivilized part of the world. And I, as the white man, the superior person, need to go in there. And he said his opinion is that even, of course, there was a religious angle to it, that he felt, that the West felt that the religious practices, many times they might have said that, oh, your things are all superstitions, ours is the real religion. Now this concept can be pretty unfortunate for any kind of religious thoughts. So without any respect, or without any, just like you have preconceived notions, you must have preconceived respect for another culture, or another nation, or another part of the world. Without that, all you're doing is trying to conquer or exercise power, uncontrolled, unbridled power over another nation or another part of the world. So he showed that in the paintings, in many of the oriental paintings as shown by the east, by the west, it's always like semi-clad dancers, or men lying down smoking pipes, or slave trade, or some of them may be true, but it's not the entire truth. That is what he's trying to say. Said traces the development of modern Orientalism by presenting a broadly chronological description. He also attempts to trace it by describing a set of devices usually common to the works of popular artists, you see, poets and scholars. He presents a review of the French and English traditions of the study of Muslim Near East during the 19th century and further up to World War One. 1 minute, World War One should be capital. Just a minute, let me just correct it, if it allows me. Never mind. For this purpose, his major focus is on the works of French Orientalists Jesus, such as Sylvester de Sacy, the works of English Orientalists like Edward Lane's account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians. Furthermore, in this chapter, he endeavors to demonstrate how Orientalism has influenced and affected the Western perceptions of the Arab Middle East and Middle Eastern perceptions of themselves. It's almost like they have been again remolded, that they've been made to believe that they need the Western, the stepping in of the West to make them a better place to be. And he has interviewed many people who were exiled or displaced in the West Bank, and he went and spoke to a lot of them. It shows in his interview that we really don't want to be enemies of the West. Do not think of us as your enemies. Some people are saying, do not think of us as your enemies. We really want to be friends with you, and you all you need to do is know what we really are. So he's tried to present that perspective from his to support in support of his theory. He reviews the careers of leading Islamicists like French scholar Lovis Massignon and the English historian Hamilton Gibb. He takes note of the lectures of Gibb as a director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, his views on the Arab mind and the aversion of the Muslim from the thought process of rationalism, referring to Islam as taught by the Prophet. According to some critics, now how has this been taken? He defines Orientalism in three different ways. Orientalism, the academic profession, as people want to study, a way of viewing the world more widely, and a mode of hegemony, that is, gaining absolute power over the Orient. So, below are sized three definitions of Orientalism. The most readily accepted designation for Orientalism is an academic one. Indeed, the label still serves as a number of academic institutions. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient, and that applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or philologist, that is, studier of language, either in his specific or in his general aspect, is an Orientalist. And what he or she does is Orientalism. What he or she practices is Orientalism. Who cannot see the slides now? Shanawaz, why can't you see the slides? Are the slides visible now? The others can see it. It's very strange. Please refresh, Shanavas. Avir, one second. Just one second. I'll just reshare it. Stop screen. Check now. Okay. So, just let me know which are the slides you did not get. 223 to 231. 1 minute. Let me just go back. So this one, 223, describes what exactly as a word Oriental means. Please remember when you're doing this slide that this part, that his idea is this, that basically you misrepresent to say that this guy is not good enough, hence I need to step in. And it's only with this ulterior motive, according to Said, that Orientalism has kind of has emerged. This, yeah, I think I had. I can imagine how bad the conflict must have been between Hamilton Gibb and Edward Said, because he's saying that it's a thought process of it's a verse to the thought process of there is no rationality. So whatever, it's Mohammedism and not, it's just nothing rational. That's what he tried to say. And then he kind of contradicted. He vehemently contradicted Edward Said. The unfortunate thing is, even about India, a lot of people in the West, I haven't personally come across it, but there exists this kind of thought process that, oh, it's only about for example, the Festival of Lights. What do? You dance in the streets. Your weddings are just dancing on the streets and a lot of noise and this and that. But they fail to appreciate the sanctity. They look at the excess, or they look at the manifestation of excess, but there is also the other angle of sanctity, of commitment, of durability, enduring feelings, which certain cultural practices or religious practices represent. So, what all that these intellectuals are saying is that they are trying to take a humanist view. They are saying that there might be some things which may not agree with your system, but doesn't mean that the whole system should be colored black. That is all that they're trying to say. There could be any religion, there could be any religious belief, there could be any cultural practices, but try to take a more broad-minded, not don't have a parochial attitude towards it. That is all that they're trying to say, without getting into any kind of discussion about yours is good and yours is correct and mine is correct and yours is incorrect, that kind of thing. I think all educated people, modern people, should have enough liberal attitude of mind to accept and respect everybody else's beliefs, and it applies to everyone. It can't be one-sided. Are we there? Are we done here? To 22, okay. Ah, wait. Up to 222. Oh, now we go to 223. This is quite easy to follow. Just this I had discussed earlier also. Okay, so you're welcome. Okay, now, so I could go ahead from the here, otherwise I'll never finish. So, the scope of Orientalism covers all the dimensions of the subject, both in terms of historical experiences and time period. It covers the subject in terms of political as well as philosophical themes. Said provides a review of the 18th century writing on the Muslim Near East and socio-political impact of Napoleon's. He actually says that in a discussion, he goes on to say that socio-political impact of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. He says that although Napoleon, as a Westerner, did invade Egypt, but he also brought in a lot of. It was not merely to exploit and take away and massacre. He actually wanted to get involved in the place. So he brought in his own resources to enrich the place. And the same thing he says about the British in India and the French in some parts of Africa. He says these colonizers, yes, they were colonizers. Yes, they were trying to take over. They were trying to colonize. They were trying to dominate, restructure. But in the whole process of restructuring, so to speak, dominating or dominating, they also brought in their own resources and they did a lot of constructive work as well in their colonies. So it must not always be open to derision or should not always be open to criticism, negative criticism. But his issue is what the currently the West is doing in the Middle East. So his issue was really what America was doing. In his interview, he says that what they are doing in the Middle East is that for them it is only a matter of convenience. What suits them, they do without any deeper involvement. That is what he is very worked up about. I'll provide the link to the video, you can see it. And he says that it's because, and it's all very without knowing the practice of jumping to conclusions. That is what is happening. His concern is there. So, Oriental structures and restructures. He traces the development of modern Orientalism by presenting a broadly chronological description. Trace it by describing a set of devices usually common to the works of popular artists, as we said, the West is presented, the Orient is presented. He says endeavors to demonstrate how Orientalism has influenced and affected the Western perceptions of the Arab Middle East and Middle Eastern perceptions of themselves. Because sometimes the occupiers become so powerful, they create so much of impact on the minds of the occupied that they start perceiving themselves the from the perspective of the occupier, the colonizer. That we will see that when we come and go into Franz Fanon. So he begins discussion, and I said that he says that Jib says it's really an irrational kind of following of what the Prophet had said. So he must have had really kind of got in trouble with him. So now we come into the most readily accepted designation for Orient is an academic one. Indeed, the label still serves a number of academic institutions. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches, or broadcasts, goes through the media to represent the Orient. And it's a style of thought based upon an existential, ontological, or epistemological, that is, knowledge based distinction between the Orient and the Occident, and the Occident. East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, the distinction many administrators, imperial administrators, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, very importantly, between the East and the West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and even social commentaries, political commentaries concerning the Orient, its people's customs, mind, destiny, and so on. And it can accommodate from classical writers, Victor Hugo, Dante, and Karl Marx. So it can be a very broad spectrum. That the Orient is like this. Like I told you the other day, that it's like everybody's either a Kubla Khan or a Ganga Din in India or in the Middle East. So, and the Khan is not even spelt as Khan. They call it Kawn, Khan, or Ganga Din, Ddin, Ddinn, or something of that sort. I've come across limericks which say things like this. Edward Said defines Orientalism by the actual political and colonial relations that the West as constructed epistemologically based on the above two definitions, and is something more historically and materially defined than either of the two. Taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, it can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient. It's almost like a company, a corporate body dealing with the Orient by making statements about it, authorizing views about it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, really. In short, it's the Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. It's almost like a firm managing the Orient. And it claims to be representing the Orient, but in doing so, it is only representing its own conception of what must be outside the construction of the ideal West. That we within our safe construction of the West, we are the ideal people, and what is not us is the Orient, which Orientalists claim to represent and travel literature claims to depict, is therefore is empty of essence. It really doesn't give a true picture, and all you do is act upon an untrue, unreal picture. Perhaps we will recognize then that the thing in itself deserves a Homeric laugh, a wild, broad laugh, in that it seemed to be so much, indeed everything, and is actually empty, that is empty of meaning, because that kind of Orient doesn't really exist the way you see it. Now, he owes to Antonio Gramsci, sorry, ruling class, I misspelled it. So the idea of the Gramsci was an Italian philosopher. He was a Marxist philosopher, political figure, and he commented a lot on the idea of cultural hegemony, that is, cultural overpowering or having absolute power, kind of controlling the minds, controlling the culture, hegemony, which is exercised in society by the ruling class. For Gramsci, the intellectuals of society function as the officers of the ruling class for the exercise of the subordinate function of social hegemony and political government, of the spontaneous consent given by the great masses, simply because they manipulate, these officers of the ruling class, they manipulate the consciousness, thereby establishing complete social hegemony, absolute power of the population to the direction imprinted on social life by the fundamental ruling class. So, a very simple example is how you behave. Very simple example: how you behave at a party, your etiquettes must be at par or must be approved by what is done, the system in the West. Which means, supposing somebody says, well, I'm not very comfortable holding the knife in my right hand and the fork in my left hand. Can I do it the other way around? Well, that is not correct. You don't meet with my approval. It is not done. So they kind of lay down the rules as to what is done and what is not done. Social life by the fundamental ruling class, a concept which comes into existence historically from the prestige and hence from the trust accruing to the ruling class from its position of being on the pedestal and its function in the world of production. So the bourgeoisie, that is the officers of the ruling class, whom they could be part of the colonized people, but they have been groomed to function as the in-between layer in order to gain complete psychological and social control over the masses. So much so that the masses automatically or spontaneously agree with what the ruler says. So we now go on to where is the case? So we now move on to Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon, we know, was an French Algerian psychiatrist, very well known psychiatrist, but he led a very tumultuous life. He himself was a victim of, actually, the book, The Wretched of the Earth, is written by, he says that it's written by a Negro psychologist. And he says his main idea is the dehumanization of the colonized, how they are reduced to less than human creatures by the rulers, and they become the wretched of the earth, and through physical and psychological violence, abuse, they are reduced to less than, they are dehumanized. They are treated like animals, and they are made to feel, they themselves start feeling that they are lesser mortals. And this can actually be changed by a violent uprising. The same violence, the abusive violence that creates this situation, must be used to overthrow the ruler. The same power, the same violence that the colonizer uses to control, dominate, and dehumanize must be used to decolonize, particularly focusing on Africa and Algeria. He talks a lot about racial discrimination. He himself was a subject. He was a brilliant student, but he was denied access into a lot of schools by the French rulers of Algeria. And I mean, after several efforts, very roughly speaking, he got into some respectable schools, and then he went to France. But he became, he almost tried to advocate. He says that talking and discussing and all will hardly get you anywhere. You must use the same weapon of violence to overthrow, because you can't really go any further down. You've been treated so badly, nothing could be worse than this. And The Wretched of the Earth analyzes the post-war decolonization movement, focusing on Africa and Algeria rather, in particular. Fanon argues the violence of colonial rule sows the seeds for its own violent overthrow. Taking violent action restores colonized people, giving them back their humanity. The first three chapters of the book tell a narrative. The narrative progresses from spontaneous uprising through national revolutions to post colonial government. The fourth chapter argues in favor of a nation rather than a culture. This one nation concept came in because otherwise, unless one insists on becoming a stronger nation standing together, sticking to mere culture will never get rid of the colonial power, colonial rule. We ourselves have seen it in our struggle for independence that a lot of violence was practiced, was seen as necessary in order to overthrow the imperial power. The fifth chapter draws on case histories to show the effects of torture in war. You see, again, this notion of thinking or perceiving the non-Western people as lesser beings. That is what makes the ruler, the colonizer, I mean, how dare they think that they can treat another nation or another race or another country, people of another country, in a way they wouldn't treat their own people. So if you think of the Indigo movement, how the lands were taken away, how the farmers were tortured, killed, their wives taken away, sexually abused, insulted, their houses were burnt simply because the attitude was, I'm not answerable to anybody, I do as I please. And what gives the Western, the colonizer or the ruling power this kind of attitude? It's only when you think that they are not my equal, they are so low down, they have no power to resist or to rise against me. I can dominate, I can scare them, I can dominate them, I can intimidate them, I can annihilate them. So, this deplorable, insufferable attitude of having absolute power and having no respect is something that has come up again and again and again in the writings of these post-colonial as well as writers who have reflected on the years of colonization. The book's preface was written by the 20th century French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and he begins by describing the world's population as consisting of men and natives. So the men are the humans, and the natives are colonized people who are not human almost. He himself didn't say, Sartre doesn't say that they are lesser than men, that is, they are lesser than humans, but he's repeating one of Fanon's points that colonialism dehumanizes people. He also believes the book's ideas will affect Europeans, although he says Fanon's book is not addressed to Europeans. The book is actually addressed to those who have been colonized, the need to rise. We in Europe too are being decolonized. How? He means decolonization will change the mindset of the Europeans. It has changed a lot. I mean, I myself see it, or I don't really, I have never come across any kind of racial discrimination or anything here. But in the older generations, I wouldn't say lack of respect, but misconceptions still thrive. a lot of people in the West still think, oh, the East is really a poor part of the world. Everybody in the East, they have got their begging bowls out and they're sitting on the pavement and begging. That attitude is very, of course, that is lack of education, lack of culture, lack of this is narrow-mindedness because they don't want to believe any other. But this has been brought up by a lot of people. You'll see when Homi K. Bhabha writes, and now we'll concentrate in Franz Fanon. He says that unless unless the colonial world, this entire attitude of colonizing the world, that I will take over to improve because they are subhuman creatures. I will humanize them. I'll bring them up to a human standard. As long as this attitude stays, one second, who's this? So, colonial rule is imposed by European states in order to exploit the resources. He's very clear about it, and he was very sharp about it. He didn't make any, he didn't really try to be gentle about it, Franz Fanon, because he himself suffered so much of discrimination. He was part of the Algerian freedom movement, and so much so that when he was dying, he was flown into Maryland to Baltimore for treatment. Like his last days, he died in a hospital. He was actually accompanied by a CIA agent, probably for his own safety and everybody else's safety. And he was so vehement about it because he had seen dehumanization, racial discrimination in its rawest, bloodiest form. So, according to Fanon, the colonial world can be understood as the encounter between two forces, those of the colonial settler and the native population, defined and sustained by violence. They do as we tell them or else. So, colonial rule is imposed by European states in order to, he's very clear, he doesn't beat around the bush. He says they colonize us to exploit us. And Europe is really the creation of the third world. It is by taking from us that they exist because they have taken so much from us. Unlike in developed capitalist societies where the economic exploitation of the masses is veiled by a hegemonic superstructure upheld by institutions such as organized religion and education system. Exploitation in the colonies is naked. That's what I said. It's crude, raw, and thus necessarily upheld by violent means of oppression, constructing as a Manichaean world based that is Manichaean world is it means it's almost like God's word has come down to describe these as the darker existence and us as the lighter existence. Not only in terms of skin color, but we are the light and they are the dark world. On an immediately clear distinction between colonizer and colonized. A central aspect of the oppression of the native people is their dehumanization and the attempt to destroy their national culture. I mean, so much so, dehumanize them to the extent that they don't. It's almost like brainwashing them, destroying their whole entity, social, political, psychological entity. This is achieved by the use of language that degrades the natives to the status of animals, the application of racist scientific theories that you guys come from the apes. You look like the apes, you come from the apes. You're yet to become humans, so listen to us and do as we tell you to do. Racist scientific theories of the inferiority of if you constantly hammer these people saying you're inferior, you're lower, you're inferior, you're stupid, you know nothing, you learn from us and do as I tell you, or else the gun is there, or I'll hang you. So, so to speak, scientific theories that science, the Western science or the developed science says that you guys are semi brain dead. You don't understand. You're unintelligent. So the fear of violence, the constant intimidation, the physical, psychological, emotional intimidation, bullying, abuse results in the dehumanization of the colonized. And this constant hammering, pounding of the mind that you are inferior, of the native population, that you are inferior, and concentrated attacks on indigenous cultural practice. So, whatever is not Western or whatever is not designed by us, whatever is indigenous or urban as we see it, is of lesser variety. The dehumanization of the natives serves a dual purpose. First, it weakens, enfeebles the natives. It allows the colonizers to escape the apparent contradictions between Western values of democracy and equality on the one hand, and the undemocratic and extremely violent oppression of the native population on the other. That is one part. Secondly, the internalization of dehumanizing and violent colonial relations destroys you see, the native himself starts to think of himself as something lesser. That this is all I deserve. I don't deserve any better. This is the worst thing that can happen. Unless one feels that I deserve better than this, I don't deserve to be kicked around. I don't deserve to be treated like they don't. The colonizers don't treat their animals so badly, but they treat other humans so badly, not as badly as their animals. So the native sense of selfhood, allowing for continued, so that kind of makes the ground quite free for them to play around, for the colonizer to play. That we have pounded them into nothing, pulverized them into nothing. So there is no resistance from them. Nobody will stand up. We have weakened them so much, they will not stand up. And the worst thing that can happen is the psychological enfeebling, the emotional enfeebling, the loss of the sense of selfhood. You're not even an existence. So, continued colonial exploitation due to a belief in fatality, which removes all blame from the oppressor, that this is all I deserve, and first of all, I'll die if I don't do it. Or I'll die anyway. I'm only meant to die serving these people. Hence, I don't blame the oppressor. So, fortunately, however, despite the myriad, let me just separate this, you can see this better. Despite the myriad tools used to dehumanize the natives, they are never fully convinced of their inferiority. Thank God for that. And it is precisely at the moment of when the native realizes his humanity that he begins to sharpen the weapons with which he will secure his own victory. With the same violence, he will hit back. The moment he starts realizing that I'm not low and I'm no less than these people. But for that, one can't just have uncontrolled violence resulting in nothing. But of course, there are guerrilla wars, there are insurgencies, and this and that. But, and he says that, in other words, the necessarily violent imposition and sustenance of colonial rule simultaneously sow the seeds of his own destruction. You have shown the way of violence. And after hitting them and hitting them and hitting them, once they have got their back to the wall, like they can't go any further, they use the same, they take your own weapon and they turn against you. Because you have shown them what violence can do. They'll use the same violence against you to get rid of you. I'll just take a short, quick break and come back. Can you hear me? Because my connection went. Okay, excellent. So we just go back to stop cam and upload. Share screen. Too many tips. Just get on with it. Okay, let me know if you can see the slide. Is the slide clear to you? One second. Now, is it okay? Has it come back on screen? Can you see it properly? Okay, excellent. Because here we have very bad inclement weather, so it was kind of fluctuating. Right. Um, where was I? We go to Franz Fanon. Okay. So he shows how colonialism sows the seeds of its own violent overthrow. See, remember all these people, particularly Fanon and Edward Said, mind you, although he spells his name as Said, as in Said, his in Arabic, his name is Sahid. They say it like Sahid, Sahid, like that. So Edward Said is, they all are talking from their own very personal experiences. So while Edward Said had his displacement, his lost home, lost country, he was he had to go away to another country to make it his home, and he kept going back to Palestine. And after his death, actually, his wife and his daughter, they spoke on in an interview saying that he never really wanted to move away from. He said that I kept going back to Palestine, to my home, and I slept in my mother's bed. It's almost like, where I was born, and I almost kind of embraced my childhood again, simply because I was deprived of it all. So the intensity of his feelings of being deported, of being exiled from his own home country, that comes out quite sharply in so his perspectives, that comes out very sharply. Now, for Fanon being a black man, an African man from Algiers, his case was even more difficult because although he did finish, he became a very renowned psychologist, and psychiatrist. He felt this discrimination, this discriminatory humiliation, very, very sharply. And it is almost like, when he says dehumanizing, it's almost like not only dehumanizing, but almost demonizing the colonized person. That they are, it's like they only practice black magic. They only practice, nobody will ever say this British man is a voodoo witch. But whenever you think of a voodoo witch or a voodoo person who's practicing black magic, it almost becomes like it comes from the dark continent. It comes from the black skinned person. So these are some people, some parts of the West, they have these preconceived notions. A whole lot of them are very liberal, they're very open minded, they are very accepting, and they are very knowledgeable. They know that all this is nonsense. But still, it's unfortunate. But then that exists in every country, in even when we think of our part of the world, we say, oh, they eat the this, or they are not hygienic enough, or something is something. So we all have preconceived, fixed notions of other nations or other countries or other geographical areas. So to overcome that, one does it through education, or the broad mindedness, the liberal attitude that education provides, or it could be the very sharp, victimized, bitter, psychological, violent attitude that develops in a human being. So when we think of, we see in the writings of Franz Mann, he wants to take the extreme step in his writings that a human being, think about it, it's quite natural that a human being, when he's dehumanized, reduced to an animal without human sensibilities or sensitivities, if he's reduced to being an animal, what does an animal do when it's cornered? Obviously, it'll try to bite, scratch, attack the way an animal does. So you reduce a human being to an animal. Now, don't expect him to react like a human being, because it is you who have taught him this violence, this ugliness. So your colonialism, the practices of colonialism, will sow the seeds of its own violent overthrow. If you have beaten him to a pulp, that is the language, that is the mode of communication he knows. That nobody sat across the table and talked to me and told me, look, I'm here to help you improve on this. He simply hit me on the head and told me, you're so low that your place is there, and I put my foot on top of your head. So that's the only language he understands. Hence, when he reacts, when the colonized person reacts, the dehumanized colonized person reacts, he reacts the same way. There are hardly any human qualities left in him. He discusses those involved in the colonial situation in terms of singular ideal types: the settler, the native, and the native intellectual, to name just three. The settler teaches the native that they are only an animal. The settler drives this nation home through violence. I'll beat, he boots. When the native realizes that, but when the native realizes that they are human, what do? They are predisposed. They are now willing to rebel against the settler. He's not saying that the native's violence is morally justified or justified in any way. He's simply offering a description that given these conditions, here is what happens. Decolonization is always a violent, particularly from the situation that he came from, is always a violent phenomenon. And violence leads to violence. Actually, his wife, once she was on the phone, Franz Fanon's wife in Algeria, and she says that all she saw from her window was that the rebels, they were trying to torch the police vehicles, killing some policemen, and then hordes of policemen opening fire on them, and an entire mass of rebels or demonstrators, they fall, they die, they fall, and they drop dead. So thing is always a violent phenomenon from both sides. Decolonization means taking the place of the settler. And how do you do? Just the way they grab their place, you grab their place through violence. Despite the abstract tone, Fanon is mainly writing about Algeria, where he had lived and worked. At the time Fanon was writing, Algerians were fighting to free themselves from the Vichy rule of the French. There is actually a range of cosmetics quite popular here called Vichy. Now I'm having second thoughts about buying them. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men, but this creation owes nothing of its legitimacy to any supernatural power. The thing which had been colonized, it's not even called the human being, the thing which has been colonized becomes man during the same process by which it frees itself. If you have overpowered the colonized through violence, it will use the same process, that is violence, by which it frees itself. So Franz Fanon's approach to violence and its effects on the individual, you will get questions on these approach to violence and why it happens. Its effects on the individual is uniquely guided by his lived experience. He was born and raised as a colonial subject in the Antilles. He then undertook medical school and psychiatric training in France, and he was in Algiers. He was denied, I told you, denied admission in schools. Although his results were very good, he was a very brilliant student. He was later an employed psychiatrist in Algeria, where he eventually joined the revolution against the French. Fanon's, Fanon outlines both the potentialities and negative aspects of violence. His most famous, both the potentialities and negative aspects of violence. His most famous and controversial remarks are those around, this is also, please mark this, around the cathartic and self actualizing effect that violence can have on a colonial subject. Why? Because so much of toxicity has been bred within the colonial subject through the violence practiced by the colonizer that he has to purge himself of those toxicities and become a man. From an animal, he wants to become a man, he'll become a man. And probably through the violent act, a violent revolution or a rebellion. However, these are often taken out of context because Fanon is certainly not an advocate of absolute violence, no. But he does seem to understand that if you live with the gun, live by the gun, you die by the gun. So, in other words, colonial rule is maintained through violence and repression. Fanon strongly emphasizes that colonial rule is the bringer of violence into the home and into the mind of the native. If all that the native has seen is violence, if the only treatment that's been meted out to the native is violence, disrespect, contempt, he will not ever become familiar with the idea of respect or mutual respect or tolerance or anything. Nobody's shown him tolerance. So he only knows the root of violence. This violence derives from the racialized views that the colonizer has about the colonized subjects. He often describes the colonized subject with ideas of backwardness and a lack of empathy and rationality. So the colonial subject is therefore dehumanized by colonialism to such an extent that it turns him into an animal. It then becomes natural for the colonizer to deploy violence. Because you're an animal, human treatment will not be given to you. So when he turns around, when the colonized turns around, he says, well, because I have been reduced to a dehuman and an inhuman, an animal, now you will only get the kind of treatment that an animal, it'll attack you. It'll not sit down across the table and speak to you, discuss with you, or come to an agreement or an understanding. So Fanon's concern with violence is critical for understanding the trajectory of the wretched of the earth, which ambitiously moved from political agitation to cultural formation to post-colonial statecraft to global philosophical reorientation. But it all begins with violence. Violence is important for Fanon as a precondition to liberation. Something Maher, in well, one of the writers, Chikarielo Maher, in Decolonizing Dialects, links to a broader concern in Fanon with decolonizing methodology and revolutionary practices, that is. Violence as precondition operates in two directions: internal to the colony among the colonizers, and external in the formative conflict between the colonized and the colonizer. Internal to the colony, Fanon breaks the colonized into three groups. First, there is the worker, whose relationship with both the colonized and the colonizer is organized around its capacity to work, the slaves. It's a complicated relationship, one that is, or somebody who's almost reduced to slavery. Not in so many words is spoken, but it's almost the job of a slave. One that is both a relation of dependency, material needs are supplied by the colonial system, and naturally revolutionary, exploited yet also upon that upon which the colonizer depends. Second, there is the colonized intellectual. He's really a compromise, the go between compromised figure who plays a crucial role across the body of the wretched. In India, we have had this kind of, the Babu culture. We'll see it in Homi Bhabia's writing, whether in relation to cultural renewal or to political resistance. The colonized intellectual mediates the relation of the colonized for the colonizer, translating the terms of colonial life into the language, concepts, and thinkable politics of the colonial power. So, uh, this is the connector, actually, what is called the bourgeoisie. What is collective catharsis? What we talked about, mass uprising. For the colonial subject, freeing themselves of colonialism, sorry, through violence. Through violence can be a cathartic experience, that is, purging experience. In Black Skin, White Mask, one of his other books, he introduces the idea of collective catharsis. Is described as in every society, every collectivity exists or must exist a channel, an outlet through which the forces accumulated in the form of aggression can be released. This term is inextricable from the colonized subjects' experience of violently ridding themselves of colonial rule. Just flush them out of the system. The violence is the intervening event which is able to remove their feelings of self loathing. All these days, not only have you treated us badly, we hated ourselves for being what we are. So, this self loathing had been internalized after constant repetition from the colonial power. The colonial subject is also able to restore their self esteem. One second. I hope there are no comments right now. Okay, great. Accordingly, for the Algerians, violence is cathartic insofar as it allows them to restore the self. They are restoring, getting back their self respect, their self worth, which was destroyed by colonialism, to this constant psychological intimidation, this insult, the humiliation, the pounding of self, the benumbing of any kind of sensitivity of self respect, self worth. This cathartic violence also allows an individual to reclaim their humanity. You reduced me to an animal, I've become a human again. You are out of my horizon. I reclaim my space. I'm also reclaiming my own existence. You will not call me an animal, and you will not describe me, or you will not paint me as a dehumanized, worthless creature rather. It concludes Wretched of the Earth with one of Fanon's most provocative and exciting pieces, evoking his much the. Do you know that the day Fanon died in the US, I mean, his opinions were so fiery, so powerful that I believe the police went and confiscated his books from the bookstores. And then later, his pictures were there all over Paris, and he was he was highly respected by people who supported this kind of restoration of self worth and the freedom from colonial rules. Most provocative and exciting pieces evoking in much the same way as the conclusion of Two Black Skin White Masks, the possibility of a new future. So, what is humanism? He asks, if it is held up to the measure of the world. That is, what does humanism look like if disentangled from the, what if we take it completely away from the European concept? Because the European concept is riddled with histories of violence and subjugation. So humanism can instead reflect or is infused with the liberation struggles of the global South, as if down there are some people, and we are high up here, the on the pedestal, far away from you. Post-colonial nations created through anti-colonial violence cannot be duplications or imitations of European states. There's no need for that. In part, this is a resolutely anti-colonial ideological position. Make for yourself, do not make for the colonizer. But it is also, the main thing is self-sufficient, be self-confident, have respect for yourself, and do not let any other power from anywhere in the world again do what it did to you in the past. But it is also, if not largely, based on a critique of Europe that understands Europe to be in a crisis in itself, to be dependent upon, at every level, structures of exploitation and extraction. Unfortunately, that was the history. So he probably thinks that Europe also has to reorient its way of thinking. First of all, live and let live. And this entire attitude of somebody down there is there for me to exploit and extract should go. Europe is a spirit built on strange foundations and characterized by stasis, that is, a sudden pause, hasn't moved on. That's what he felt. Because he was a victim of that kind of such certain principles of so and so being lesser and so being more. Post-colonial states need different foundations and so must work with new concepts in new imaginations of collectivity. Central to this are conceptions and imaginations of the human itself, that you are a human being. So you are endowed with empathy, with respect, with tolerance, with coexisting with others. So develop a new way of thinking and endeavor to create a new man. Fanon does not give this new man content. He says that the new man belonged. He didn't know. I mean, he died well before he could actually see what happened, but he did hold out some light of hope, provided the colonized states came out of their cocoon, of their chrysalis, and they decided to take their own decisions, correct decisions, and moved on from their murky past. So let's look at Homi Bhabha. Oh, it's already 10:12. The theory of mimicry. I'll quickly do this. So, an increasingly important, Homi Bhabha has many theories, one of mimicry, one of hybrid hybridity, one of well, we'll first deal with mimicry, an increasingly important term in post-colonial theory because it has come to describe the ambivalent, that is, mixed feeling relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. When colonial discourse encourages the colonized subject to mimic the colonizer, again I'm saying all these things, this attitude of mimic, so to become a blurred copy of the colonizer. When are you mimicking? You're blindly imitating. Why? Simply because you want to upgrade yourself to become like the colonizer. That is from on one side. The other side is the colonizer himself wanted, or herself wanted, some of a handful of the people of the colonized to mimic them to become. We'll come to Macaulay's theory that who will be in appearance Indian, and Homi K. Bhabha is actually writing about the Indian colonization and mimicry. He would, in appearance, be an Indian, so hence he would be dark skinned. I don't know why they think all Indians are dark skinned. He should be dark skinned, like turban attired, but in his attitude, in his mind, in his speeches, he should be an Englishman. More so, he must share the same point of view of the Englishman as against an independent Indian point of view or an independent global citizen's point of view. Because unless this kind of psychological, attitudinal, and existential grooming took place, it would be very difficult to keep one's talents into the colony, the colonized area. Because these people, this breed, this hybrid people, they were the mimicking people. They were the main tools of the colonizer, the ruler, to gain control over the masses. So the result is never a simple reproduction of these traits. Rather, the result is a blurred copy of the colonizer, and that itself can be quite threatening. Why? This is because mimicry is never very far from mockery. A. B. It parodies whatever it mimics. Secondly, a very perfect mimicry can actually eradicate the need for the colonizer to come in and colonize in order to improve the area which he thought needs improvement. So, mimicry has often been an overt goal of imperial policy. For instance, we'll see Macaulay's theory. He said, Minute to the Parliament derided Oriental learning, that they know nothing, and advocated the reproduction of English art and learning in India. And I think it was his idea to introduce that they should only study English literature, forget about their own culture, their own literary work, everything, or work of art. They should only study our literature, they should only study European art, they should only study imbibe European theories and ways of living. He suggested that the riches of European learning should be imparted by a class of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. Class of people, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, opinions, in morals, and in intellect. I would like to know what he meant by in morals, but never mind, he's not here to answer that. And in intellect. So basically, again, this question of grooming comes in, that you groom a group of people into thinking it's like live, dream, speak English, be like an Englishman. But you are not really an Englishman. So what you are is a hybridized. Hence, you're accepted with a mixed feeling, with ambivalence. He seems to suggest that imperial thoughts or discourse is compelled to make it so in order for it to work. That's what he felt. The term mimicry has been crucial in Homi Bhabha's view of the mixed feeling of colonial discourse. For him, the consequence of suggestions like Macaulay's is that mimicry is the process by which the colonized subject is reproduced as almost the same but not quite. Why? Because the whole objective of colonizing, in order to bring it up to the mark, if they all become the same, then I don't need to colonize anymore. So it kind of defeats the purpose. So the copying of the colonizing culture, behavior, manners, and values by which the colonized contains both mockery and a certain menace. Why the menace? Because there'll be no need for ruling them anymore. They have become just like you, so now they can look after themselves. So that mimicry has at once resemblance and menace. Mimicry reveals the limitation in the authority of colonial discourse, almost as though colonial authority inevitably embodies the seeds of its own destruction. Same reason why what I said. The line of descent of the mimic man that emerges in mimic man. The mimic man is a book by V.S. Naipaul. So his other concept. The line of descent of the mimic man that emerges in Macaulay's writing, claims Bhabha, can be traced through the works of Kipling, Forster, Orwell, or V.S. Naipaul, and is the effect of a flawed colonial mimesis, imitation, in which to be anglicized is emphatically not to be English. They didn't want you to become English. You can be anglicized. You can be given, it's almost like a crow wearing a peacock's feather, trying to wear a peacock's feather. The menace of mimicry does not lie in its concealment of some real identity behind its mask, but comes from its double vision, which, in disclosing the ambivalence of colonial discourse, also disrupts its authority. And it does not necessarily emerge from the automatic opposition to colonial discourse, but comes from the disruption of colonial authority, from the fact that its mimicry is also potentially he's also mimicking, he's also parodying in a when it becomes an excess, it becomes cartoon, it becomes like a cartoon. So they themselves, the entire thought could have been a flawed one. So what happened was, one of the most widely employed and most disputed terms in post-colonial theory, hybridity, commonly refers to the creation of the new transcultural forms within the contact zone. Obviously, when you mimic, a hybrid species comes up. They are half Indian, half English, or half whatever country. Here in this context, we are talking about Indians. They're half Indians, half English. Hybridization takes many forms: linguistic, cultural, political, sometimes. And the worst part is it is done at the cost of chipping into own their own culture. It's chipping away from their own culture. They probably create a hybrid group of people who hate their own, or who decry their own culture, their own religion, their own language, their own people. Bhabha contends that all cultural statements and systems are constructed in a space that he calls the third space of enunciation or speaking. Cultural identity always emerges in this contradictory and ambivalent space, which for Bhabha makes the claim to a hierarchical purity of cultures untenable. For him, the recognition of this ambivalent space of cultural identity may help us overcome the exoticism of cultural diversity in favor of the recognition of an empowering hybridity within which the cultural difference may operate. For him, it is culture is always dynamic, it's moving, it's a very fluid thing. So it is the in between space that carries the burden and meaning of culture. And this is what makes the notion of hybridity so important. It's frequently used in post colonial discourse to mean simply cross cultural exchange. So, this use of the term has been widely criticized since it usually implies negating and neglecting the imbalance and inequality of the power relations it references. By stressing the transformative cultural, linguistic, and political impacts on both the colonized and the colonizer, it's been regarded as a whitewashing of cultural differences. It's a very difficult word, assimilationist. That is, it's the concept of assimilating policy by masking or whitewashing cultural differences. So it really leads to nothing, the critics say, because it's neither here nor there, lacks originality. So colonial mimicry comes from the colonists' desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is, as Bhabha writes, almost the same but not quite. Thus, as we said, mimicry is a sign of a double articulation, a strategy which appropriates the other as it visualizes power. It appropriates because it kind of justifies the other as it visualizes power. Subsequently, the discourse of mimicry is constructed around ambivalence, again, mixed feeling, contradicting ideas. The colonized people remain in a state of constant flux or uncertainty. So there is always an anxiety, there is always a kind of an oscillation. Bhabha brings forth the tension which occurred between the colonizer and the colonized, providing slippage of the identity. So the hybrid person, the person who's mimicking, he knows, he either knows or is kind of subconsciously aware that I might mimic the guy and say, I have become a sahib. A, he knows he's never accepted as one of them. B, if you read Naipaul or even Kipling's writings, you'll see that sometimes it's a very disillusion, it kind of creates a complete disillusion for the hybrid species, the mimicker, that he tries his best, he tries to emulate, mimic his mentor, that is the colonizer, as much as he can. He thinks he's become one of them until it's slapped onto his face that you are there, but not quite. You are not an Englishman. And then comes the realization that he probably was just used as a tool to gain more control as an interpreter. So learn your place. Hence, mimicry leads the colonized people to have double identity, and on the other hand, they continue in the state of constant fluidity due to cross cultural encounter. They're a bit here, bit there, know a bit of this, know a bit of that. So, creating an oscillation in their identity and in their entire existence. And all this, actually, these insights, likes of Homi Bhabha, they have They have provided us because how they have done, because they have actually thought about it, they have actually analyzed the situation of the hybrid. It's the what was the purpose, the motto of mimicry. It was a welcome gesture, definitely, but with a purpose. So whatever aspiration the hybrid, the intermediaries had for mimicking the colonizer, they are those aspirations are not really met. So they become disillusioned. They understand at a very crucial point that they might have been within the circle, but really not fit for the table. And at a very odd moment, they are told to learn their place and live within their own circuit. So we stop here today. I shall meet you on the 4th. I'll offer you some notes and we'll meet for doubt clearing. I'll let you see some videos with interviews of these people so you can have a better understanding and discuss some questions. I actually, you have some questions. I think Mr. Dr. Palit posted some questions, and you get some questions in the self learning material as well. Have a look at them and we can discuss. Okay? Thank you very much. See you on the 4th, same time, same place. And I hope all of you have signed in, like filled up your forms.